been a human rights activist since I was 9. That was the year I tried to kill my little brother. But it was all in the cause of democracy, because I knew about democracy. I believed in democracy. You know what you learn in school. All men are created equal. All people have an equal voice and equal choice. Everybody is equal before the law. And he was being rude, obnoxious, cruel to a little school friend of mine who was a refugee from a poor family who had come to play with me. And he jeered and he made comments to her, and he was awful. So I jumped on him and I decided to kill him. Fortunately, my father was around washing his car, and he actually didn't believe in murder. So he peeled my fingers off my brother's neck, and he lived. Well, in the little over half a century since then, I have been looking for democracy in action, in life and in people. And I kept this as an ideal, something I was going to find. And I looked in 6 areas, just like the 6 circles you see up on the wall, because I knew I was going to find it. And if anybody spends their whole life looking for democracy in action in people and in institutions, believe me, you're going to end up being very frustrated. You're going to end up being very disappointed. And if you try to ensure that other people live according to the democratic ideals that you have, sometimes you're going to end up being very angry, like I did, and use violence to try to make sure that other people act the way you want them to. But when I looked, I said, okay, let me start. Let's start with all men are created equal. Well, let me introduce you to my beloved Joshua. Joshua was born, as you can see, he's hydrocephalic. He doesn't have the front part of his brain. The top third is not there. He was also born with the inability to use his legs and his hands and his arms. He'll never speak. He makes noises, but he can't speak. He was born to a 13-year-old mother as a result of an act of domestic violence, and she was told that he would only live for 18 months. Well, Joshua just had his 8th birthday last month. He just won't give up, that child. And on the screen now, you'll see another 8-year-old. Now, this 8-year-old, you will see, has his entire brain. He's not microcephalic. He has a brain. He can walk. He can talk, and he has a big sister there with him. And the big sister obviously treated her little brother much better than I treated mine. His name is Usain Bolt. And if you try to persuade me that all men are created equal, then I'm going to point to these 2 8-year-olds and say, how come? Where? So I looked at the second area. And the second area, which normally comes to us early in age, was school. And I've taught in school. Apart from going to school, I've taught kindergarten and primary school and secondary school and university, and you don't find democracy there. You don't have a choice and a voice. You may have a voice, but to say that you have a real choice in the curriculum, that is decided by some gods up in the Ministry of Education or in the board of directors of a school or a university. Even the methodology of what you learn is not your choice. Education is not, they teach you about democracy, but it is not a democratic institution. But one thing I did learn, and that is what you see on the screen, is what is called a Gaussian curve. This is been very useful as I look through the other four categories where I was looking for democracy. You can see how the curve goes. At the bottom, there are about 10 to 15% of the population. This is a study of demography, which just means everything about people: height, weight, intelligence, whatever. At the top, there's another 10 to 15% who are at the top of the scale, and the rest of us are in that big hump in the middle. And I found that as I went through life looking for democracy, that this was something that became very obvious. So I went on to the fourth now area, and that was religion. Now, religion was something which was very important to me. And by the time I was 12, I knew everything about religion, okay? I knew everything about God, I knew everything about religion, because I had been given the very responsible position of an assistant to the junior Sunday school teacher in the church that my parents went to. And so anytime they asked a question, I had the answer because I was an authority, as people who are in important positions in any religion are authorities, and you don't question what they say, especially not when they tell you what to say comes from writings that were done 2,000, sometimes 3,000 years ago for guidance for a desert community. And you had better listen. Then I went deeper into religion. And just what was very interesting is I found that religion and politics have always been very, very much connected together. And what I found in the history of religion was there was something that the historians call the First Axial Age. Now, the First Axial Age was between the 8th century BC and the 3rd century BC. And what was really fascinating was that in various different parts of the world, where people were not in connection with each other at all, the Far East, the Middle East, Europe, parts of Africa and South America, at the same time, in this little 500-year period out of 70,000 years of human civilization, at the same time, the concepts of monotheism arose, which meant that all the major religions on which our now religions are founded, like Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, they all came up at the same time. And interestingly enough, at the same time, in the Greco-Roman Empire, the concepts of political governance were formed: oligarchy, tyranny, military dictatorship, aristocracy, and of course in Athens, what the one man, one vote, all men are created equal and are equal before the law, they called democracy. Now that to me was really, really important. And at the same time, or a little bit later, a few years later, I ran across the teachings of what was perhaps in the 20th century the most important archaeologist, anthropologist, geologist. He was a Jesuit priest called Teilhard de Chardin. And Teilhard de Chardin, way before his time, intuited that these periods in history have the characteristics of what is called, the scientists now call a quantum leap in human consciousness. And what he said made sense to me, so I kept on looking. I kept on looking for the concepts of democracy. And so I went next into law and into the judicial system. And one of the first, and of course this is tied up with politics because it is parliaments that develop laws. And I ran into somebody whose name is Alcuin. He lived in about the 8th century. And he gave us a warning about what happens when the law takes over and when it is applied by government. And what he said, it's in Latin up there, but for those of you who just don't happen to speak Latin, What it says is, don't listen to anybody who says the voice of the people is the voice of God, because the tumultuous voice of the masses is usually based on insanity, or is very close to it. Now, I don't know if there are any lawyers in the hall tonight, but if there are, I'm sure you will tell me that all men are created equal and have equal rights before the law. And I like to believe that, so I looked at that. But then spending all those years dealing with domestic violence, I kept finding women who were victims of domestic violence in the courts having as someone who would speak for them, someone from the Free Legal Aid Society organization, having to face in court a senior counsel who was hired by their perpetrator, and the inequality of the voice was enormous. If you steal a bottle of rum from a rum shop, and you get caught and you get charged and you serve your time, is that the same as when somebody gets a government contract to build a stadium and adds millions and millions and millions of dollars onto it so it triples in cost as commissions build up? Is that equality? Is there equality before the law? I am not sure that I was going to find it before the law. And so I looked a little bit deeper, and one of the most important laws, of course, is, remember when they told you about the only thing in democracy that you're sure of is death and taxes? Well, maybe death. But when it comes to taxes, I have discovered that if you have a very good lawyer who can find you a tax shelter in Cayman Islands or the Bahamas or Panama, until the Panama Papers catch up with you, or you listen to the voice of a presidential candidate who has changed the respect for tax law obedience throughout the world by saying it is clever to avoid tax. So let's go on. Let's go on to Parliament, which is the seat of democracy, and I spent over a decade in Parliament. I didn't expect every human being to have an equal voice in Parliament because Parliament isn't big enough, but presumably we choose people to speak in Parliament to say what it is we want them to say, except they don't. Because before every sitting in Parliament, there is what is called a caucus. And at the caucus, people are told by whichever their organization is what they should say, what they shouldn't say, and what they must say. And that didn't seem to me to be the same thing as equality of voice and everyone having a voice in Parliament. And I was getting a little bit discouraged by this time. And then I went back to Teilhard de Chardin. And there he was again. And I remembered what he had said about evolution. Now, when Teilhard de Chardin talked about people evolving and the quantum leap in human consciousness, and of course, because he was a Jesuit priest, he was talking about spiritual consciousness, but I started to look around at all the other categories that I had looked at, and I realized that there was evolution. A lot of his work on evolution didn't get published, of course, because the Vatican didn't approve of evolution at that time, so that's democracy for you. But when you look at what democracy started off as, don't forget, one man, one vote. Well, it's only been in the last 100 years that women have had the vote, a little bit less than 100 years. And the whole concept of democracy has evolved as we have evolved. And I realized that while I agree with what Winston Churchill said, that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms that have been tried by human beings, What we are in the middle of is the second axial age. And we are on the verge of it, and we are going into it. But this time, it's not that people are not in contact with each other all over the world developing these ideas by themselves. They're all in touch. They're all in touch through technology. And it seems to me that already 10% of the population, that 10% at the top of the Gaussian curve, have evolved. They have evolved partly because, as the people who do research in neuroplasticity will tell you, that the brain can actually, the convolutions of the brain can actually change with repeated, regular stimulation from the same area. And if you use the internet and the internet apps continuously, it's going to do something to your brain. I mean, we all know that, even if you're on your cell phone all the time. But people are evolving in terms of the way they think, their spirituality, their consciousness, because the first quantum leap was a quantum leap in consciousness. And we appear now to be on the verge, or have started, on another second axial age. God only knows what's going to come out of it. God only knows how we are going to change, how society is going to change. But I am fairly confident that along the way, democracy is going to change so that it is no longer just a dream, a myth, something that somebody is going to pursue looking for, but it's going to be a day-by-day, step-by-step, person by person, institution by institution reality. Thank you.